Okay, so let's keep moving on and telling a lot of stories, and some of your assignments are going to have to do with these stories that I'm telling. So I hope you've been paying attention. So let's talk about our consumers. They are organisms that consume or eat living materials. So here we have some consumers that appear to be eating producers. So I think this is a little algae. So this is an amoeba that is reaching out to grab this algae. And this is where I would usually say, so who remembers from Unit 2 what this is called? Challenge yourself, see who can remember it. Drum roll, please. It's called phagocytosis, which was from Unit 2. So pretty weird. It's reaching out to grab this algae and it's going to consume it for its nutrients. And then here we have a koala, which is eating a eucalyptus leaves. So we have different consumer types. Both of those would be herbivores, although the amoeba is actually an omnivore, but we'll get to that later. So an herbivore can be called a primary consumer, meaning it is the first consumer in the food chain, and they're going to consume plants or plant material. So here we have a squirrel eating like a nut, and then over here we have a butterfly that uncoils this tube that goes down into the flower and is like drinking up like nectar. And so not really eating the plant, but is consuming plant material. Then we have carnivores, which can be called secondary consumers because they're the next consumer in the food chain. And they consume animals. And here we see some carnivores. And one of the things that's kind of weird, which if you look at this closely, is it says it's Africat. And it does show 3 cats, but some people get thrown off by the hyena, which I historically thought was more like a dog. But actually, some studies of their skeletons and some other stuff actually indicate that they're more like a cat, which is kind of weird. And they have some kind of cat ancestors. They're almost like just something new. I don't know. They're hyenas. Anyways, there's probably some name for it, but I don't know what that is. All right, then we have omnivores, which which could be primary or secondary consumers because they consume plants or animals and animals. So skunks here, they're eating like seeds and stuff, but they could also eat like worms and bugs and maybe lizards or frogs or something. And then here we have a big giant bear, and obviously they're big time carnivores, but they might eat other things like berries, maybe even like mushrooms and other stuff. Okay, so then some of the coolest animals are what we would call an apex consumer, which would be the highest level consumer in the food web. And here are some apex consumers that are really famous, like lions, grizzly bears, killer whales. As long as they're full grown and healthy, there's really not anything that can mess with them. And we also have apex herbivores. Let me see if the next slide has any of those. No. So apex herbivores, so these are all predators, but there's also herbivores like elephants, giraffes, the big whales, and some other animals. Moose, although moose can be kind of swarmed by wolves, but they're pretty big. They're probably pretty hard to take down. But we do have some apex consumers that aren't predators like we see in this picture. All right, then we have some really important consumers called detritivores. They consume detritus, which is like dead organisms and waste. And they play an important role because they're getting rid of some of this nasty stuff. So vultures are getting rid of these carcasses and stuff, and that might help. Like otherwise, it might rot and spread disease. So that's actually good that vultures do that. And then here's a dung beetle, which uses animal poop for nutrients and laying its eggs in and stuff. And then this is a sea cucumber, and literally this powdery stuff down here is detritus. It's fish poop and dead stuff that's floated to the bottom, and a lot of these detritivores actually clean that up on the coral reefs and keep the reefs clean and get rid of that nasty stuff. All right, and then one of my favorite types of organisms are decomposers, and they are organisms that use enzymes to break down living or dead materials and then recycle the nutrients back into the ecosystem. So they are in some ways perfect organisms, except they can't create their own nutrients because they're not producers, they're decomposers, but they help ecosystems a lot. So this is a slime mold which you actually drew some slime, like a slime mold in your cladogram, if that rings a bell. And then these are mushrooms actually coming out of a piece of poop. And so they help get rid of nasty and dead stuff, which is good, and they cycle it back into the ecosystem for plant growth and animals to use. All right, then we have what are called keystone species, which is a species that keeps the community stable. And it's very rare that it would be a large animal. Usually, though, all producers and all decomposers are always keystone species, and they get overlooked. So the plants and the algae, or the bacteria and fungus and protists that are decomposing things like in the soil or in the water, life cannot exist without organisms doing those two roles. But so we've talked about this before, a lot of animals are sort of like bonus organisms living off of what the producers and decomposers are providing. Especially the larger, more advanced animals, they're just living off kind of everything else. They're not really doing much for the community. So let me just say this again. This is incredibly important. The producers, the plants and algae, and the decomposers, fungus, bacteria, certain protists, they are absolutely critical for the health of the community and need to be protected and preserved so that animal life can exist. There are some other examples, though. Beavers are cool animals that are keystone species, so they can build these dams, and that causes the rivers to kind of fill up, become like a lake or a pond, and then other animals and organisms can live in there and raise their, like fish babies and bird babies and other things can live there. And when Europeans came to the North America, they were sort of fascinated by the beavers, and people started wearing beaver hats, which to me sounds kind of gross. But they became a big thing in Europe, and so people came to North America to kill beaver, to sell the beaver hats in Europe, which became like a trend or a fad. And as that happened, they wiped out huge populations of beaver to try to make money. And what happened was these dams started breaking down, and then there was all this flooding and problems that were happening. And these Europeans realized that these animals were really important and were actually like maintaining certain things in the ecosystem. And so this is just an example of where if humans don't think about the importance of other organisms and we kill them for our own purposes, we might be creating problems for ourselves as well as hurting nature. So beavers are cool. Okay. And then another example, as you saw in your video, our coral. Coral is a keystone species. Coral create these structures that other animals can hide in and keep their babies safe. They're little tiny animals that provide food in their food web, and they can create around them these really beautiful, lush communities of life where, some would obviously say that coral reefs are the most beautiful communities of life anywhere, and it's all because of these little animals that build these big structures that create the reef and provide habitats and food for a lot of other animals. So I hope you enjoyed that Coral Reef movie, because I think that's a really amazing movie, and I hope everybody watched it. Alright, I'm going to stop there for this video. So we're going to stop this one here so I can take a break and make some more in a little bit.